Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can review the case of Jodi Arias. She was convicted in 2015 of murdering a young man named Travis Alexander, who was somebody that she was in a relationship with. So I'm going to be taking a look at the timeline here, but also the mental health and personality characteristics that may have been going on in this case. Just to be clear, I'm not diagnosing anybody, rather just speculating based on the evidence that's available. So Jodi Arias was born in 1980, and Travis Alexander was born in 1977. There's a lot of information available on this case, more than I can possibly cover in this video. I'm going to try to cover the facts and the timeline that are important specifically to the mental health and personality aspects, as well as a few other points just so the story kind of makes sense. So we see in September of 2006, Travis met Jodi Arias at a conference in Las Vegas. And they connected at that time, they were talking on the phone every day, and later on we see in court records that they exchanged 82,000 emails during the course of their relationship. In February 2007, they officially started dating. In June of 2007, they broke up, but they continued to have a sexual relationship. We see at that time that Travis allegedly said that there was nothing about Arias that indicated to him that she was marriage material. In December 2007, Travis began dating another woman, and allegedly Arias became jealous at this and slashed his tires twice and sent a harassing email to his girlfriend. This is what he reports. Of course, we don't know this for certain. Now, in January 2008, we see that Arias sent sexually explicit texts to Travis. So something still, of course, seemed to be going on there in terms of a sexual relationship. But then we see in April 2008 that Arias moved from Arizona to California. In that same month, we see that Travis sent a text to Arias saying that she was one of the prettiest girls on the planet, and requested that she send him a naughty picture. So again, kind of more evidence that indicates there was, of course, that sexual relationship still in place. And it's really not clear how they define the relationship according to the evidence we have to this point. Now, in May of 2008, the grandparents' house of Jodi Arias, where she lived, was burglarized, and one of the missing items from that burglary was a .25 caliber automatic Colt pistol. This becomes important later on. In June 2008, so this is the month when Travis Alexander was murdered, we see that he told friends that he suspected that Jodi had hacked into his Facebook account, and he said to her that he didn't want to see her ever again, to stay out of his life forever. Again, this is what he told friends that he said. On June 2nd, 2008, we see that Arias rents a car in Redding, California. On June 4th, 2008, Arias visits Travis's home in Mesa, Arizona. They had sex and they took explicit photos of one another. This is when it's believed that the murder occurred, on June 4th, 2008. So we see on June 5th, she visits kind of a romantic interest in Utah. They don't have sex, but she visits with him. And he noticed that she had bandages on. On June 9th, 2008, Travis's friends were concerned that they haven't heard from him. They went to his home and found him dead in his shower. He was in a state of advanced decomposition, and there was a lot of blood in the master bathroom. So we see here that ultimately it's believed that Alexander was shot in the head with a .25 caliber pistol, and that he had been stabbed 27 times. Somebody also cut his throat from ear to ear. Now, later on in testimony, it gets a little confusing. It appears he might have been stabbed first and then shot. We don't really ever get a clear answer on what happened in terms of the order of the attacks. The police found a .25 caliber shell casing on the floor. They also found hair and a latent print of blood and some DNA. So they had some information available in terms of evidence at his house. And they also found a digital camera that was in the washing machine and evidently was run through a wash cycle. So they questioned Travis's friends, and many of them indicated that Arias was the really number one suspect. They said that Arias was obsessed with him, she wouldn't let him go. When he would try to sever ties, she would threaten to kill herself. This becomes important later on, talking about the mental health aspects. Travis would tell her that he didn't want anything to do with her, and she would come to his house uninvited. So kind of a lot of these people indicated that it must have been Jodi Arias that was responsible for this murder. Now on June 17th, images were recovered from the memory card that had been in the washing machine, and they saw in those images Travis was naked in the shower just before his death, apparently posing for the photographs, but they also found a dark and grainy photograph that looked like a person on the floor of the bathroom bleeding. We also see that there were many nude pictures of Arias on that camera, and she was in provocative sexual poses. The hair and the bloody print that I talked about earlier, they belonged to Arias, and the DNA that was found was a mixture of Travis and Jodi's DNA. So there was evidence here that placed Jodi Arias at the scene of Travis's death, and of course they suspected it was a murder. We see that the grand jury indicted her on first-degree murder charges, and at this time she said she had nothing to do with the murder. She would never hurt Travis. He was her friend. In September, during an interview, she indicated that she was present at the time when Travis was murdered, but she wasn't the one who committed the murder, that two intruders actually came into the house and murdered Travis. There was a lot of detail in this story that she made up about the intruders, but essentially what she said is they broke in, they killed Travis, and she miraculously escaped. Later on, she changed her story and said that she did kill Travis Alexander, but it was in self-defense, that she was forced to kill him. Now moving to January of 2013, the trial starts, and again, a lot happened in this trial, a lot of back and forth, and mistakes were made. But what we see here is that the prosecution essentially pointed out that Arias made up all these stories before she kind of settled on the self-defense story. They also asserted that Arias did murder Travis Alexander because he had defensive wounds on his hand. So again, this gets into kind of what happened first, the shooting or the stabbing, but we don't get a real clear answer on this. Now, the defense team acknowledged that Arias had killed Travis, but said that the question is what motivated her to do it. They indicated that Travis pressured Arias into having sex with him, and there was domestic violence in that relationship. So March of 2013 is where we kind of get into the mental health portion of the trial. And this was actually pretty interesting. We see that there were 3 mental health professionals who were psychologists involved, and 1 mental health professional they referred to as a psychotherapist involved. 3 of these were for the defense, 2 psychologists and psychotherapist, and 1 psychologist for the prosecution. So the first psychologist for the defense said that Arias likely had acute stress at the time of the killing, which sent her body into a fight or flight mode to defend herself, and stopped her from retaining memory. So she was diagnosed with PTSD by this psychologist. Then we see a psychotherapist who comes on the stand, and this individual specialized in domestic violence, and she said Arias was a victim of domestic abuse. We see another psychologist, this one for the prosecution, that comes in and says that there was no evidence that Travis abused Jodi Arias. This psychologist also indicated there was no evidence for PTSD or amnesia in Arias, and claimed that the memory loss that Arias was describing, which was memory loss where long periods of time were missing, this was inconsistent with traumatic amnesia, that the gaps in memory should have been shorter if it was really amnesia. So what this psychologist indicated was that Arias suffered from borderline personality disorder and had an unstable sense of identity and was terrified of being abandoned by others. So we see that there's post-traumatic stress disorder on the defense side, and then abuse, and then borderline personality disorder on the prosecution side. And then we see a psychologist for the defense come on the stand and say the borderline personality disorder diagnosis was not appropriate, and actually what was going on with Arias is she has anxiety stemming from trauma. So some sort of anxiety disorder. So really we get the sense from all this testimony that whoever hires a mental health clinician gets the story that they want. Right? That's one of the senses we get. It doesn't seem like we should have all this different testimony when they are interviewing the same person. There's a kind of an old joke about mental health clinicians. It can be applied to counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, a lot of different people. That says if you put 3 mental health clinicians in a room with one client, you're going to get 4 different diagnostic impressions. And that's really kind of what we saw here. Nobody seemed to agree on what was going on in terms of mental health with Jodi Arias. So in May of 2013, she was found guilty of first-degree murder, and on April 13, 2015, she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And as far as I know, she's still in prison to this day. So this was really an interesting case. And I think one of the reasons this was interesting is we saw this juxtaposition with post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder. Again, different stories from different clinicians. And this is what I refer to as a dangerous intersection, right? Whenever we see mental health and the law come together, this is an intersection it's just best to avoid it, right? It's just a bad place to be. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, that contains these mental disorders was written for treatment. It wasn't written to explain why people commit crimes. So this is just, again, a dangerous and kind of messy intersection of mental health and the law. So with this in mind, let's take a look at what could have been going on here with Jodi Arias in this case. So I've seen a lot of arguments for borderline personality disorder in this case. Of course, the prosecution, psychologist, but a number of other people, I think, look at this case and think, okay, borderline personality disorder explains a lot of the behavior. But this is kind of interesting because when you look at the symptom criteria for borderline personality disorder, I think you could actually make a stronger case that it doesn't really explain what's going on. So I'll go through each symptom and kind of point out why I think the borderline personality disorder diagnosis doesn't make sense based on what we can see. Again, I didn't get to interview Jodi Arias. I've never met her. And other clinicians who haven't met her in the same position. Now, the mental health clinicians that testified, they did meet her, so they had a much better vantage point here. But either way, let's take a look at these diagnostic criteria. The first one for borderline personality disorder has frantic efforts to avoid abandonment. So allegedly, she showed up uninvited to Travis's house. She threatened to commit suicide if he didn't see her. She was stalking him. She recorded sexual conversations they had, I guess in an effort to use them against him later on so he wouldn't leave. So you could make a good case for meeting this first symptom criterion, frantic efforts to avoid abandonment. Moving to the next symptom criterion, we see unstable relationships. Now what's interesting here is I don't really think this symptom criterion is met. We see it with Travis, to be sure, but is there a recurrent pattern evident? So this gets into kind of a gray area because if somebody has one relationship for a long time, you could argue that's the only real context available, so you have to judge it based on that. So this one, I'm kind of divided, but I would say I don't really see it except, again, in the one relationship. Moving to the next symptom, we see identity disturbance. And of course, this one was specifically pointed out at trial, but I don't see any clear evidence for a unstable self-image, identity disturbance. I don't see this one being met. The next one is impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging. Now, this is important because a lot of people have said, well, this one's a clear, symptom here, right? We have impulsivity because of the whole activity of the murder, right? That seemed impulsive, and other behaviors that she exhibited. But it's in 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging. So impulsive, yes. Self-damaging, no. So I don't think this criterion is actually met. Suicidal behavior is the next symptom. I don't really see this. This isn't clear. There's threats of suicide, but no suicidal behavior that would meet the symptom criterion. Again, in my opinion, based on the evidence I have available. Affective instability, well, yes, maybe, but it goes along with the frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, so it's in that context. So this is one of my criticisms about affective instability as a symptom criterion. It has this overlap. So independent of the frantic efforts, I don't really see affective instability in this case. Next, we have chronic feelings of emptiness. I don't really see this one either. Moving on, we have inappropriate or intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. Well, clearly with Travis, again because of the murder she committed, but not with other people. So it gets in kind of the same argument we see with the unstable relationship pattern. If just the relationship with Travis counts, then yes. If you need kind of a longer history, then no. The last symptom we see is paranoid ideation or dissociation. I don't really see any evidence for this. So this leaves us in kind of a weird place, right? We see some of the symptoms could be endorsed, theoretically, but there's no diagnosis. Now, many believe that Jodi Arias is really a classic presentation of borderline personality disorder, and she may be, but not based on the information we have available. Again, the mental health clinicians that actually saw her had a much better vantage point, and of those 4, only 1 came back with a borderline diagnosis, and of course 1 refuted that diagnosis. Now, borderline personality disorder is in the same cluster, cluster B, as another personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. I've also seen a fairly good case made that this is what was going on in the case of Jodi Arias. But again, if we look at the symptoms, we get kind of a murky picture, right? A grandiose sense of self-importance. I'm not sure. Fantasies about success, wealth, and power. I don't really see that. Believing oneself to be special or unique. Maybe. Requiring excessive admiration. Maybe. A sense of entitlement. I think we certainly saw that during the trial. Exploiting other people interpersonally. That's a possibility. Lack of empathy. That seems pretty clear. Jealousy. That also seems clear. And of course, arrogance seems clear. So I think you could make a better case, but not a perfect case, for narcissistic personality disorder. But again, some of these symptoms appear to be present during her murder trial. And murder trials exert an incredible amount of stress on an individual. So I'm not sure it's a very good assessment context. So narcissism, probably. Narcissistic personality disorder, it's hard to know. I wanted to point out a few other interesting points in this case. I think they're really interesting in terms of the case itself, but also the mental health and personality piece. If we look at Jodi Arias during the trial, she, in interviews, references all this exculpatory evidence, right? So evidence that would have indicated that she didn't do it, including photographs that couldn't be found and people that saw bruises on her, but those people couldn't be located. So this kind of seems like it could be something going on with the personality. Again, maybe narcissism, maybe psychopathy, but there's just a lot of evidence that she said existed that clearly didn't exist. At least they didn't have access to it. We also see that she indicated she lied about the murder because she was scared and ashamed, and she said she regrets what she did after the murder. So she didn't regret the murder itself, but what she did afterward. And she also said that it was difficult to think that she could be pushed to do something like that. And I found that to be an interesting statement. So if she was claiming self-defense, why would it really be surprising that she defended herself? It doesn't make a lot of sense. It sounds like she's really talking more about committing the murder than about sticking to her story of self-defense when she made that particular statement I saw in one of the interviews. She also believed that the majority of people in the public were against her, and I think that was pretty accurate. But she said that one of her psychologists told her that society has a need to persecute people. Now, who knows if that psychologist really told her that, but either way, this is what she believed. She believed that all these people that were against her, in a sense, or at least some of them, were persecuting her. So this really kind of speaks more to the narcissism piece that we see here. So interesting points on the premeditation, right? So she was convicted of first-degree murder, which is premeditated, but a lot of people made the argument that maybe it was murder too, or manslaughter, but not premeditated murder. This is interesting because if she did premeditate the murder, why did she take pictures, right, during the night that she was with Travis on June 4th, 2008? Why take pictures? If murder was the plan, that doesn't make any sense. And we see these stories about the gas can. So allegedly she bought a gas can so she could avoid having to stop at gas stations, but she had a reason for doing that. I don't know, this didn't seem particularly premeditated, but then again, why bring a gun to the house? So I kind of think with this case, she was open to the possibility of murder, but maybe had not definitively made up her mind when she showed up that night. That would probably still qualify, of course, as premeditated, but I don't think it was like 100% premeditated. The evidence doesn't really support she went there with the intent to kill for certain, like that she knew she was going to commit a murder. Now later on, she allegedly would tell a cellmate that her target was actually somebody that was dating Travis, but cellmates are notoriously bad witnesses, so I wouldn't really worry too much about that. I don't really weigh that as serious evidence. So overall, this could have been premeditated, but again, I'm not sure if she was totally committed to the idea. Now, some other interesting things I think we can learn from this case, right? So if somebody's stalking somebody else, that individual should not maintain a sexual relationship with that person, right? So if somebody's stalking you, you really have to take precautions, and being in a sexual relationship with that person just leaves somebody very vulnerable, and it can ramp up some of the negative behaviors that are associated with stalking. In no way is this to blame the victim. Travis Alexander was probably not aware of how personality worked and all this, but just something I would say now to somebody who maybe is in a stalking situation. Having a sexual relationship when being stalked is not a good idea. I don't see any evidence it's a good idea, and I see a lot of evidence that it is a horrible idea. We see in this case, I mentioned this before, that the experts seemed to see what they wanted to see, right? They seemed to see what was favorable to their team, the defense or the prosecution, which is a little disturbing, but it's fairly common in trials. But I think what was really curious about this is that borderline personality disorder, in this case, was the bad diagnosis, for lack of a better word, whereas PTSD engendered sympathy. So what I mean by this is when we saw this defense psychologist get up and say that Arias had borderline personality disorder, we see another psychologist say that borderline diagnosis isn't appropriate, even though, of course, it could have been a correct diagnosis. So what you can conclude from this is that having no mental disorder was better than having an official mental disorder listed in the DSM. So in terms of diminished capacity, or maybe trying to sway a jury or get a lighter sentence or whatever, nothing was better than borderline personality disorder. This really speaks to the incredible power of the stigma associated with this disorder. I think that borderline personality disorder was kind of weaponized in this trial, and the label, the diagnostic label, was placed on Jodi with the idea that borderline somehow equaled really bad behavior or evil behavior. And again, I don't like this intersection of mental health and the law. I don't like when mental disorders are diagnosed and then we're also supposed to infer from that that somebody's not good or has bad intentions or whatever. So the vast majority of individuals with borderline personality disorder will never get involved in anything even remotely close to what Jodi Arias did in this case. So sometimes people just do bad things. There's not always a disorder that goes along with that. So I think that's kind of an important lesson or piece of information that we can take from this Jodi Arias murder case. I know whenever I talk about borderline or narcissistic personality disorders or kind of famous cases like this, there are going to be a lot of opinions, people that agree or disagree with me or have other opinions. Please put those opinions in the comments if you have them. They always build an interesting discussion. As always, I hope you found this description of the Jodi Arias murder case to be interesting. Thanks for watching.